For 75 years, the most powerful military alliance in human history stood between Europe and its darkest fears. 47 nations, 32 of them bound by a single sacred oath. An attack on one is an attack on all. It was the iron spine of the Western world, the unbreakable contract that kept the peace, rebuilt the continent from rubble, and made Europe the most comfortable civilization in recorded history. I mean, he has repeatedly made completely contradictory statements about his plans for this war and how long it will be. And every time he is asked which of his diametrically opposing statements is actually U.S. policy, he just shrugs his shoulders and says, it's both. You've said the war is, quote, very complete, but your defense secretary says this is just the beginning. So which is it? And how long should Americans be? Well, I think you can say both. You just said it is a little excursion, and you said it is a war. So which one is it? Well, it's both. It's both. When asked about his own mental health at the White House today, here's what Donald Trump said. What is your response to critics who say that I don't care about critics? What is your response to critics who say that it is your mental health that should perhaps be examined as this war continues? I haven't heard that, but if that's the case, you're going to have more people like me because our country was being ripped off on trade, on military, on everything. A whole civilization will die tonight. Hitler never said that. No head of state in the history of the world ever said that. Civilization had to wait literally thousands of years until today, April 7th, 2026 at 8:06 a.m. for a head of state to say and threaten that a whole civilization will die tonight. No cruel king ever threatened that. No mass murdering tyrant anywhere in the world ever said that or even thought it was possible. And so the United States of America must now live with the permanent stain on our history that we are the only country in the world that has produced a head of state who said a whole civilization will die tonight. And with that statement, it could not be more tragically clear now. In the span of a single brutal week, Donald Trump didn't just walk away from it. He buried it, salted the earth, and told Europe to find its own grave to lie in. The obituary of NATO was not written in a war room. It was not drafted by generals or signed in some solemn ceremony in Brussels. It was delivered in fragments through slammed air bases, blocked flight paths, closed skies, and a single word fired from the most powerful social media account on earth. Cowards. That was the word. One word aimed directly at the leaders of the alliance America built, funded, and bled for across 3 generations. And with that word, the curtain didn't just fall on NATO, it was ripped from the ceiling and set on fire. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to understand what NATO actually meant to the United States. It was never just a defense pact. It was the crown jewel of American global strategy, the mechanism through which Washington kept Europe pacified, kept Russia contained, kept the Atlantic trade lanes open, and kept American military boots on European soil without a single European parliament voting against it. The United States didn't protect Europe out of generosity. It protected Europe because a stable, dependent Europe served American interests perfectly. Europe got the security umbrella. America got the geopolitical throne. That was the deal. Unspoken, unwritten, but absolute. For decades, European leaders played their role beautifully. They sent token troop contributions to American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They attended NATO summits with handshakes and photo opportunities. They gave speeches about shared values and the transatlantic bond while quietly spending less than 2% of their GDP on defense, letting Washington carry the weight and redirecting their savings into welfare states, green energy fantasies, and bureaucratic empires headquartered in Brussels. America paid the bill, Europe cashed the check, and everyone pretended the arrangement was a partnership between equals. Trump never pretended. That was his cardinal sin in the eyes of European elites. From his first term, he called NATO what it actually was, a protection racket where the protected party had stopped paying. He demanded burden sharing. He threatened to pull troops. He said the quiet part out loud, and the diplomatic establishment on both sides of the Atlantic screamed in horror. But they didn't change. They waited him out. They assumed he was noise, not signal. They assumed that after the storm passed, the old order would return and the American taxpayer would resume footing the bill for European comfort. They were catastrophically wrong. Because when Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he didn't just bring his old grievances, he brought receipts. And the moment Europe gave him the opening he needed, he didn't hesitate for a single second. That opening came with the Iran crisis. When Washington moved militarily against Iran in the spring of 2026, the request went out to European NATO allies. Open your air bases, allow overflight, support the mission. It was not a radical ask. It was the kind of logistical cooperation that allies had extended to each other without question for 70 years. But Europe said no, not quietly, not apologetically, loudly, publicly, almost triumphantly. Spain's defense minister, Margarita Robles, stood before the cameras and declared that no American aircraft conducting operations against Iran would be permitted to use Spanish airspace or Spanish bases. Pedro Sanchez called the American-led operation reckless, illegal, and unjust. The strategic air bases at Rota and installations that Washington had operated for decades as the forward spine of American power projection into Africa and the Middle East were suddenly, unilaterally, off limits. The domino effect was immediate and devastating. France halted military coordination. Italy shut the doors of the Sigonella base in Sicily the moment ground crews realized the cargo being loaded onto American aircraft was bound for the front lines against Iran. Portugal sealed its Atlantic corridor, a maritime and aerial gateway that American forces had used since the Second World War. In the space of 72 hours, 5 NATO members had collectively amputated the logistical arm of the American military in Europe. The Pentagon's operational planners were staring at maps that no longer made sense. B-1B Lancer bombers, among the most sophisticated weapons platforms ever constructed, were being rerouted thousands of miles over open ocean because their treaty allies refused to grant them emergency landing rights. The aircraft that represented the apex of American military power were being treated like unwelcome strangers by the nations whose freedom they had been stationed there to guarantee. One incident crystallized the humiliation with brutal precision. On March 18, 2026, a B-1B Lancer, tail number 8601, returning from a strike mission, was denied entry into French airspace, then Spanish airspace, then Portuguese airspace in sequence by 3 separate NATO governments in real time. A strategic bomber of the world's only remaining superpower, flying a combat return, was turned away at the door by its own allies like a rejected visa applicant. The story leaked within hours. By the time it reached Washington, it had already become a symbol, not just of a policy disagreement, but of something far deeper and far more permanent. It was the physical proof of a relationship that had already died long before anyone admitted it. The silence that fell over the White House in the hours after that incident was not confusion, it was calculation. Because Donald Trump had been waiting for exactly this moment, not hoping for it, waiting for it. The betrayal he had been predicting since 2016 had finally materialized in undeniable, documented operational reality. Europe hadn't just refused to help, it had actively obstructed. And now the gloves were coming off. The question was no longer whether the United States would restructure its relationship with NATO. The question was whether NATO would survive the restructuring at all. And the answer that came out of Washington in the days that followed was colder, more absolute, and more final than even the most pessimistic European analysts had dared to predict. The response from Washington did not come through diplomatic channels. There were no emergency calls to NATO headquarters, no back-channel messages to European foreign ministries, no carefully worded statements from the State Department designed to soften the blow and preserve the appearance of unity. Donald Trump picked up his phone, opened his social media account, and delivered the verdict of the world's most powerful nation in a single word: cowards. It landed in every European capital like a detonation, not because of its vulgarity. European leaders had grown accustomed to Trump's bluntness, but because of what it represented. This was not a negotiating tactic. This was not pre-dawn bluster to be walked back by noon. This was the President of the United States officially, publicly, and permanently categorizing his NATO allies as enemies of American interest. The diplomatic translation was simple: the alliance was over. Trump did not stop at one word. He followed with a torrent that stripped away every remaining pretense of partnership. He accused NATO leaders of hiding in the shadows while American pilots flew combat missions over Iran to protect the global energy supply that kept European economies alive. He described the Strait of Hormuz as the vein that carried Europe's oil, Europe's gas, and Europe's survival, and reminded the continent that it was American naval power, American air power, and American political will that had kept that vein open for decades. He had asked for ships. He had asked for planes. He had asked for nothing more than the basic logistical cooperation that allies owed each other under the very treaty Europe claimed to cherish. And they had said no. So now the bill was due, and Washington was no longer paying it. These were not talking points crafted by communication staff. They were the unfiltered declaration of a superpower formally exiting its role as Europe's guardian, protector, and underwriter. The most devastating blow, however, did not come from Trump himself. It came from Marco Rubio. For years, Rubio had functioned as the institutional safety valve inside the Trump administration, the figure who traveled to Brussels, spoke the language of multilateralism, and reassured nervous European diplomats that beneath the noise and disruption of America First, the foundational commitment to NATO remained intact. He was the bridge between Trump's instincts and the old world order, the man European leaders called when they needed to believe the alliance still had a pulse. That bridge collapsed without warning. In an interview that detonated through NATO headquarters like a precision strike, Rubio did not defend the alliance. He condemned it. He described the situation where a NATO member, Spain, was publicly bragging about denying American aircraft access to its airspace during an active military operation while still expecting the full protection of Article 5 the moment its own territory came under threat. He called it a scam, not a flaw, not a problem to be negotiated, a scam. When the most reliably pro-NATO voice in the entire Trump administration looks into a camera and calls the alliance a scam, the era of reassurance is finished. There is no bridge left to cross. There is no adult left in the room. There is only the wreckage. The British betrayal sharpened the knife further. For more than half a century, the United Kingdom had been the cornerstone of the transatlantic relationship, America's most trusted partner, its most reliable military contributor, its unsinkable aircraft carrier positioned permanently off the coast of continental Europe. Britain had stood shoulder to shoulder with Washington in the Gulf War, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Libya. The special relationship was not merely a diplomatic phrase. It was a lived reality backed by shared blood, shared intelligence, and shared sacrifice across generations. Starmer ended it with 4 words: Britain is not your soldier, delivered not in anger, not in crisis, but in the cold, calculated language of political self-preservation. Starmer framed his position as acting in the national interest. He cited domestic economic pressures and public opposition to involvement in the Iran conflict. But in Washington, the framing was irrelevant. What mattered was the action. Britain, the last reliable pillar of the transatlantic alliance, had publicly refused to stand with the United States at the moment of maximum pressure. Trump's response was instantaneous and surgical. Go and get your own oil. Learn to fight for yourselves. We are not coming back. The special relationship built across 80 years of shared history and sealed with the blood of 2 world wars was buried in a shallow grave by a British prime minister who chose domestic polling numbers over the oldest friendship in the Western world. What followed from the White House was not a policy adjustment, it was a demolition order. Trump issued what can only be described as a total divorce decree to the European continent, structured across 3 absolute pillars. First, energy independence. If Europe wanted oil from the Middle East, it could dispatch its own navies to escort the tankers through the Strait of Hormuz because the U.S. Navy was coming home. Second, security privatization. If Emmanuel Macron wanted a missile shield over Paris, he could build it himself because the American taxpayer was permanently finished subsidizing the defense of governments that locked their skies to American aircraft during a hot war. Third, the Iranian toll. Every nation that had refused to stand with Washington during the operation against Iran was now officially placed on the unfriendly list, with all the economic, diplomatic, and military consequences that designation carried. Europe had made its choice. Now it would live inside that choice without the safety net it had spent 75 years taking for granted. The continent that had grown accustomed to lecturing the world about democracy, human rights, and the rules-based international order, always from the comfortable shelter of an American-funded fortress, was now standing outside in the cold. The gates were locked, the lights were dimming, and for the first time since 1945, the most powerful nation on earth had made its position unmistakably clear. Europe was no longer America's problem. But the real question, the one keeping European leaders awake in their capitals from Lisbon to Warsaw, was not whether America had abandoned them. It was what was coming next, because Trump had not just withdrawn the shield, he had made a promise. And his promises, as Europe was finally learning, were not the empty threats of a politician. They were operational directives. So what exactly had he promised? And how much time did Europe have before it arrived? The fallout did not wait for diplomats to draft their responses. It arrived in supermarket aisles, at petrol stations, and on household energy bills before the ink was dry on any official statement. Across the European continent, the economic consequences of the NATO rupture and the Iran conflict combined into a single crushing wave. Gas prices surged 70% in under 3 weeks. Governments from Madrid to Berlin began issuing conservation advisories, urging citizens to reduce heating, limit travel, and brace for prolonged scarcity. The European Central Bank, already navigating the wreckage of post-pandemic debt and sluggish growth, was now staring at an inflation spiral it had no tools to stop. Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief, stood before reporters and admitted with the hollow eyes of someone who had just watched their entire strategic framework disintegrate that she had no good news to offer. That sentence, delivered by the person responsible for coordinating the foreign policy of 500 million people, was the most honest thing spoken in Brussels in years. There was no good news. There was only the reckoning. The human cost was compounding by the day. Citizens who had been promised energy security, green transition, and European strategic autonomy were now being told to stay home and ration fuel. The political consequences were erupting in real time. Approval ratings for incumbent governments across France, Germany, Spain, and Italy collapsed simultaneously. Streets that had been filled with farmer protests and cost of living demonstrations weeks earlier were now filling with a different kind of anger. The fury of populations who felt their leaders had gambled with their security and lost catastrophically. The European project, already straining under years of institutional overreach and democratic deficit, was now absorbing a blow it had never been designed to withstand. The architecture of post-war European stability was not cracking. It was crumbling floor by floor. And in the middle of this continental devastation, one man sat entirely at ease. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, who had been sanctioned, isolated, lectured, and condemned by Brussels for years as a democratic backslider and a Russian sympathizer, was now the only European leader with cheap energy, a functioning economy, and a direct line to the White House. While his neighbors scrambled to secure alternative fuel supplies and emergency defense arrangements, Orban was already positioned. His early accommodation with Moscow on energy, his refusal to antagonize Washington, and his consistent argument that NATO expansion and European strategic adventurism would end in precisely this kind of catastrophe had all been dismissed as authoritarianism dressed in geopolitical language. None of it looked like authoritarianism now. It looked like foresight. The man Brussels had spent years trying to isolate was the last man standing in a burning house, and he was smiling. The post-war order did not crack slowly. It did not send warnings. It did not give Europe time to prepare. It disintegrated in days under the weight of decisions that European leaders had been postponing for decades. Decisions about defense spending, about energy dependency, about strategic autonomy, about what it actually meant to be an ally rather than a beneficiary. The American shield is gone. The era of comfortable lectures delivered from behind someone else's armor is finished. And as the lights go out across Brussels, as inflation devours savings, as energy grids strain under the pressure of a conflict Europe refused to engage in, the continent faces a question it has no prepared answer for. When the protector leaves and the predators remain, how long does the prey actually survive?